According to Albert Einstein, we cannot solve a problem from the same level of consciousness that created it. My name is Corinna Stoffel, and I'm the host of Toward a New World. The world seems to be falling apart. Are you as frustrated as I am with the talk about how to fix things or what needs to change, yet nothing changes? In the episodes, I invite people to look from different perspectives, sometimes even contrary to the current points of view. My intention is to evoke a different level of consciousness by empowering listeners to explore what is true for them and begin to live their lives from that place, thus changing their lives and through it, the world. If this appeals to you, I ask you to subscribe to the podcast on this channel.
Hello and welcome. Here we are for another episode. Today I wanted to look at perceiving the web. What do I mean with that? On some level, I think all of us acknowledge that we are part of the web of life. Yet, what does that mean? We tend to say, yes, intellectually, we are part of life, but what does it really mean, being part of the web of life? So let's start. Visualize a spider web. There you have nodes, and one node is connected to another node. But each of those two nodes are connected to a number of other nodes and other nodes and other nodes. So there is a big connection. It's not just node 1 to node 2, but indirectly it may be node 3, 4, 5, and 6. So nature has a web of life. Not a difficult thing to imagine. And yet, I want to use an example when in Yellowstone Park, the wolves were introduced back into the system. Wolves are a keystone species. And their introduction to Yellowstone had a major impact. And in a way, it can show the relationships, the connections. Yellowstone had way too many elks. And not having any predators, really, they grazed standing until the food in that area was gone, and then they would move on to the next area, and then the next area. With having way too many elks, that had an impact on nature. Trees didn't grow anymore because they got chewed down as they were coming out of the earth. So I saw in the park fences that protected areas so the trees could grow. Standing at the edge of a river, they started trampling down the edge, which caused dirt in the water, which affected the number of fish in that area. So imagine now the wolves are being reintroduced. The wolves are hunting the elk. The elk learned that it's not safe to stand in one place and eat and then move on, maybe. So they changed from standing and grazing to grazing while also slowly moving. And initially, not much changed. The wolves got, the number of wolves really grew because there was abundant prey. But there was a point reached where, looking at the statistics, the number of elk had drastically dropped. The number of wolves had drastically risen. But at that point, as a sudden, the number of elks became sort of stable and the number of wolves dropped. Because even for a predator, it is not normal to be successful with every hunt. So, not having as many elk anymore, the number of wolves declined until there was sort of an equilibrium reached. And then, as a result of that equilibrium, trees started to grow, bushes on the edge of a river started to grow, stabilizing the river edges. That meant that birds came back. That meant that there were more fish in that area. Can you see now? What do the wolves have to do with the fish? What have the wolves to do with the birds? Reintroducing a keystone species changed the whole ecosystem. So everything is connected. Even though we may not perceive it initially, we may not perceive it directly, like the wolves have nothing to do, as I said, with the birds or the fish. Yet indirectly, with the elk not staying stationary when grazing, but moving, a lot changed and had effects downstream. Connections are not linear. Yet that is something that we believe, that A is connected to B, and that's it, nothing more. But if everything is connected, how can A be connected only to B and not a whole bunch of other things? If I look at us humans, we are all connected. We are all connected into nature. We are part of the web of life, as I said in the beginning. But do we really, really know this? Know this as part of our being? It's more of an intellectual exercise. And then couple that with what we are entrained to, that we're all separate. I have this body. You have your body. There may be somebody sitting next to you, but you are not connected per se. You have your individual bodies. Yet, quantum physics shows that energetically we are connected. And for the purpose of this episode, I really don't want to go into the quantum physics aspect. But if we are connected, then a connection between two things can be perceived as linear, but there is more to it. And that is where we start missing the boat. We do not recognize that there are so many more connections to that one thing than what we initially perceive. For us, it's linear. But in reality, it's what I would call, it's spherical. There is the connection, and then there is the other connection, and connection, and connection, like in a spider web. So, what if we start looking at connections from a web perspective instead of a linear perspective that only two things are connected? The two that we perceive as being connected, that we may assume are connected without looking, is that next thing connected to something else? And if I change that next thing, it has an effect on other things. And I need to consider that effect if I want to see the whole picture. So the reality is that right now, most of us, and especially in the business world, we often see a very fragmented picture, not a holistic picture, because we're not willing to look or unable to look at the other connections that are not necessarily obvious. And I want to bring it back, remind you of Yellowstone, that the reintroduction of the wolves not only affected the herd of prey animals, the elk, but also affected the whole landscape. Trees started growing, bushes started growing, animals started to come back, and everything became richer. Everything is connected. The wolves being part of the ecosystem again affected the number of fish in the river. Not an obvious connection. But if we really look deeply at what else is connected, we end up there. We can perceive it. We have experienced it. And are we willing and able to take the information that nature is giving us in that example and apply it to economy, apply it to business, apply it to the connections that we as humans have? It requires a bit of stepping out of the linear way of looking at something, of the linear way that we all are separate individuals, that there is no connection, and yet there is. I mean, even with humans, have you ever walked into the room and somebody was really angry in there, and there just had been a verbal fight? Are you able to perceive that when you walk into the room? I've heard people say literally, you could cut the air with a knife. It was so heavy. We do perceive it, but we do not acknowledge it. Are we willing to go there and acknowledge it? And acknowledge that connection, to acknowledge the ability to perceive things that are not necessarily straight away visually or auditorily, like in the room with the fight, perceivable, because they stopped the fighting when you came in. Yet you still can perceive it. I want to use another example, a more recent example that we all experienced. When the lockdown with COVID happened, how much did nature change? I saw pictures of the canals in Venice, where as a sudden there were fish swimming, and you could see the ground, which is not something I have seen when I was in Venice, and I was a few times there. The water was murky. We as a sudden saw animals exploring cities because the traffic was gone. There were hardly any people on the road. It was safe for the animals to come in. And they responded right away and said, let's see and explore that. I have heard that in India, as a sudden you could see the Himalayas, which due to the air pollution had not been for many, many years. Or in China, you could actually see a blue sky, which always had been gray due to the air pollution. A little bit of change in the human behavior has a huge impact on nature. Why would that happen if nothing is connected? I'm leaving you with that thought. And contemplate, and the invitation, contemplate and see what connections can you find? How far out can you perceive a web? And it's not that it takes special skills. It takes the willingness to explore. What happens if? That is a very valuable question to ask. And I want to invite you to do that. What happens if? Take care. And I will see you next week. Bye-bye.